Many people wonder about the difference between patach, kamatz, and Kamatz Katan. I wanted to say a few words about all of these, and also mention Chataf kamatz, the kamatz with a kind of shva. There is such a vowel in certain letters. You'll notice it's not a regular kamatz, but kamatz with two vertical dots, like a kind of shva. It's called Chataf kamatz. So I'm only going to discuss three main accents, even though there are more than three, but the three main accents that I'm going to discuss is Ashkenazic standard accent, the accent of some generally considered Hasidim, although there's no such thing as a Hasidic accent, of course. Hasidim are people who lived somewhere, and generally people who come from there, even if they were not Hasidish, they would speak with that accent. But generally today, those Orthodox Jews who pronounce the Hebrew words with that accent are Hasidim, so that's why it's kind of associated with certain Hasidim, Polish and certain other Hungarian Hasidim. And the third accent is the Sephardi accent. Now, the modern Hebrew is based mainly on Sephardi accent, but not quite, and I'm not going to go into this at all. I'm going to only discuss the three accents that are used by traditional Jews in prayer. So, the standard Ashkenazi accent is that patach is pronounced as a, and kamatz is closer to o sound. Now, I noticed something interesting, that Ashkenazim from various lands, besides that there were, of course, some differences in pronouncing the specific letters, whether it's consonants or vowels, of course, Ashkenazic Jews in different communities pronounce them somewhat differently, just like Sephardim in different lands pronounce things differently. Not all Sephardim pronounce things the same. And I'm not talking about Yemenites, I'm talking about other Sephardim. Yemenites, of course, have their own peculiar accent that's different from everybody's, but we're discussing just the rest of the Sephardim. So the geographically, Sephardim lived in so many different places, from far west in places like Morocco and Spain before they were exiled from Spain, and all the way to the far east, Middle East, whatever you want to call those areas. I was born in the Soviet Union. We used to call those republics Middle Eastern republics. That's places like Uzbekistan. Bukharian Jews used to live there. So that's very far on the east compared to the rest of Sephardi Jews. Who we call Sephardi Jews today, more Edot HaMizrach really. They're not Sephardim. Sephardim are Jews from Spain, but Edot HaMizrach, many of them centered around Israel. Many of them lived in close proximity to Israel. Places like Iraq, ancient Babel, that was a huge exile at some point. Most of the Jews lived there. Syria, a lot of Jews lived there. And here in America, there are a lot of Syrian Jews. But besides that, there are a lot of Sephardim who lived, or rather, Edot HaMizrach, who lived very far away, as far as Afghanistan and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, areas that are incredibly far. So you wouldn't expect all those people to speak exactly with the same accent, or pray with exactly the same accent. So obviously, there are differences. And similarly, even though Ashkenazim lived in closer proximity to each other, but there were differences. So we're not going to go into the smaller peculiar differences. Just the pronunciation of cholom, the dot on top of the letter, the o sound. There are so many different pronunciations by Ashkenazim. Oi, au, a. You ever heard people who pronounce o like a? That's actually the Litvische, the regular Lithuanian and Belarusian pronunciation. Some Lubavitchers pronounce it that way. The Lubavitchers used to pronounce the name of Hashem, for instance, Adei, and then Noi, not Ado, Adei. So O was pronounced as A. That's one of the pronunciations of Cholom. But today my discussion is only with regards to Kamatz and Patach. So by regular Ashkenazim, generally, Kamatz is pronounced with something similar to O. But I noticed something else. This is why I started digressing a little bit, that different people, depending on where they come from, pronounce somewhat differently. And this is already not the issue of originally where this particular group came from and how they pronounce the Kamatz, but rather the accent today, right now. For example, a Jew living in America is not going to pronounce the same way as somebody whose native language is, German or Hungarian. My point is that this also adds to the accent. For instance, I can try to pronounce the prayers in various different accents. I can try to imitate Sephardi accent, I can try to imitate Ashkenazi accent, but the first accent I have is the Russian accent, just like you're hearing me speaking in English with an accent, a Russian accent. So too I will have a Russian accent no matter what I'm gonna say, including Hebrew. That's why I could recognize a person who comes from the former Soviet Union, if they say Kaddish, for instance, in the synagogue, almost always I can recognize this is a Russian person saying. It doesn't matter what accent they're trying to imitate, whether it's Sephardi, Ashkenazi, but the first accent, the first layer, is the Russian accent. On top of it already something else. So that's what's happening here too. So when I say that Kamatz is similar to O sound, it's true about a lot of the Ashkenazim who live in Israel, who daven with Ashkenazi accent, and some of the European Ashkenazim. But in America, their sound is not exactly like O. From what I understand, it's closer to the way they pronounce the U as A, meaning when Americans pronounce the U sound, there are two pronunciations of the sound, depending on which word it is. So in a word, for instance, cup, C-U-P. I heard that a lot of the Ashkenazim here pronounce Kamatz like that, or something similar. I don't know to what extent it's true and how widespread this is, but I'm just trying to say that American accent plays a role for people for whom at least the native language is English, and American English specifically. I don't know, in Britain it's probably different. And by the way, in Britain itself there are so many different accents of English, which probably influences the way they pronounce the Hebrew. But coming back to, for simplicity's sake, we'll say that the general pronunciation of Kamatz by Ashkenazim is O. And there's absolutely no difference between Kamatz Katan, Kamatz Gadol, and Chataf Kamatz. Generally, Ashkenazim do not distinguish those three. All three are just O sound. And patach is A sound. So that's one approach. Different approach by some Ashkenazim coming from certain areas of Poland and Hungary and certain other places. They pronounce some Kamatzes as U kind of sound. Not all Kamatzes. It depends on certain other laws, which I'm not going to go into, and I'm not so familiar myself how they distinguish. But the way they pronounce, for instance, the word Baruch, not as Bo-Ruch, but as Bu-Rich. Now, Rich is a separate issue that the U becomes E by them. That's a separate issue. In those types of areas, they pronounce the U sound as E. But I'm just talking about the first sound in the word Baruch. They don't say Bo-Ruch, they say Bu. Bu-Rich. Bu-Richatu. That's the second pronunciation. At last, the regular Sephardi pronunciation. So, regular Sephardim, ideally, as Rav Ovadia Yosef writes and many others, should distinguish Kamatz and patach. Patach and Kamatz are not both A sounds. One is slightly different than the other. Now, what exactly is the difference? There's a dispute. Some say that Kamatz sounds a little bit between O and U and A. It's something between O and A. Others say that that Kamatz is a longer sound than patach. Whatever the case may be, there is some difference between Kamatz and patach. Rabbeinu Bachya, who was a Sephardi Jew, specifically emphasizes that even though those sounds are similar, but there is a difference. And he writes it on specifically the name Aleph Dalet Nun Yud, that when it's written as with Kamatz, it's the name of Hashem. When it's written as patach, all it means is my lords, my masters. So Lord, when he greets the angels, he says Adonai, my masters. And Rabbeinu Bachya writes that Avram, when he greeted Hashem, that's why there it's Kamatz. So according to Rabbeinu Bachya, and he was Sephardi, he lived in Spain, there should be a difference between Kamatz and patach. It's a slight difference, but there is a difference, because otherwise you won't distinguish between divine name and just a secular word, which means my Adonim, Adonai, my masters. That's just a nice way to say to many people, my lords. So the main name of Hashem has to be pronounced differently slightly. Now, in practice, the vast majority of Sephardim, even when they pray, they do not distinguish Kamatz and patach. The distinction is so slight that they almost don't distinguish at all. What do Sephardim distinguish, and this is true about modern Hebrew as well, is Kamatz Katan, and also Chataf Kamatz. Now, the way this letter looks is exactly the same as regular Kamatz, but some Sephardi Sidurim, in order to distinguish, write it in big. So it's a kind of paradox that Kamatz Katan, small Kamatz literally, is written big in order to attract attention, because the vast majority of Kamatzes are regular, which is Kamatz Gadol, the big Kamatz. So to attract attention to the small Kamatz, it's written bigger than the rest. That's one way the Sephardi Sidurim can distinguish it. There are other Sephardi Sidurim that I saw that put something on top of the letter to distinguish, like maybe a circle on top of the letter, to make sure people know which Kamatz is Katan. Now, the most common word that you'll find where it's Kamatz Katan is kol. Kol or chol when it's after something, right? V'chol Chaim, yodu chasela. Right? The chol, when it's written with Kamatz, is still pronounced as O, not as A. It's Kamatz Katan. Another less known word is chokhmah. Chokhmah is not chachma, it's chokhmah. And there are many other words, less commonly used, that have Kamatz Katan. Now, how do you know if it's Kamatz Katan or Kamatz Gadol? Well, if it's Chataf Kamatz, if it has Kamatz and two dots next to it, first next two dots and then the Kamatz. That's Chataf Kamatz, as I mentioned, kind of like a Shva Kamatz. So that Kamatz is always O, even by Sephardim. But the Kamatz Katan that doesn't have a Chataf next to it, it's very hard to distinguish. The laws are many and nobody on the fly could simply do it. Mostly Sephardim just remember which ones are Kamatz Katan. And as I said, there are Sidurim that emphasize Kamatz Katan in order to make it easier for Sephardim. For Ashkenazim, there is no need for it because they pronounce the same way. They pronounce this O both, Kamatz Katan and Kamatz Gadol and Chataf Kamatz. But for Sephardim, there are some Sidurim that emphasize Kamatz Katan in various ways. It has to do with this idea that certain shvas are shvana and certain shvas are shvanach. The shva, the two dots on top of each other, two vertical dots. That's a sound that sometimes is pronounced as kind of little eh, and sometimes not pronounced at all. I'm simplifying things right now, but this is enough for you to know if you don't know yet. So many Sidurim, including Ashkenazi Sidurim like Katzkol, have a way to distinguish shvana from shvanach. Now, the Kamatz Katan is a small letter. Kamatz Gadol is a big letter. There are big letters and small letters. Tseri, for instance, is a big letter, but Segol is a small letter. And so too with others. There are differences between various types of vowels. Some are considered Tnuah Gdola and some are Tnuah Ktana. So usually when it's the longer the Tnuah Gdola, after it, the Shva, if the Shva follows it, the Shva has to be Shva Na generally. It's pronounced as well. Where Shvanach follows usually the shorter sound. So that's why Kamatz Katan, a lot of times you could, if you know these laws and you could quickly figure it out, which I don't think many people can do on the fly. But generally, if Kamatz Katan will be used, it has to do with the fact that the next Shva is Shvanach. That the Shva there kind of finishes up the syllable, in a sense. The part of the word, and that's why the previous sound has to be the shorter type of sound, and that's the Kamatz Katan. When it's Kamatz Gadol, generally the Shva, if it's followed by Shva, it's going to be Shvana. But then you have to know which Shva is which, so this is also complex. Again, many Sidurim point out which Shva is which, so it's not so difficult. Just to mention, in Shema, it's especially important to say all the letters correctly. So as far as I remember, there are only 3 cases of Kamatz Katan in Shema, in Kriyat Shema. Besides the Kol, various types of Kol, Bechol Levavchem, those ones of course are always Kamatz Katan. But there are also 3 other places. Uvishoch Becha, not Shach Becha, Shoch Becha. So that's Kamatz Katan. Twice in the first and second paragraph of Shema, it says Uvishoch Becha. You should pronounce these words when you lay down and when you get up. And also Uli Ovdo, not Avdo. Uli Ovdo, it's a Kamatz Katan. So those are the, if you pray with Sephardi accent and you don't have the Siddur that distinguishes the various Kamatzes, these are the 3 places you have to remember that they're pronounced as O, not A. And generally speaking, modern Hebrew is supposed to do that too, but again, not all people in Israel may know all the words where it's Kamatz Katan. As I said, the laws are pretty complex. By the way, even the word Kol, there are exclusions in the entire Tanakh. One of the exclusions we actually say in the morning on Shabbat, Kal Atzmotai Tomarna, not Kol Atzmotai. I think there's one more exclusion in the book of Mishlei, but that one we don't say during prayers anyway. So it's an interesting thing that even the word Kol could be Kal for some reason. And on this one I'm going to end for today. If you like this video, please press like and please subscribe to our channel.